This is Chapter 6, Security Operations and Administration, Part 1. The learning objective is to explain the role of IT operations administration and security policies and the relationship between the three. The key concepts are the role of security administration within an organization, the components of an IT security policy infrastructure, data classification standards used by organizations in the Department of Defense, change management and configuration management, and the system lifecycle (SLC) and the system development lifecycle (SDLC). First, we'll talk about security administration. The group of individuals responsible for planning, designing, and implementing and monitoring an organization's security plan. Before you can form an administrative team, your organization must identify and document the assets and then assign responsibility of each one to a person or position. Once you have a list of assets and know who is responsible for each one, you can form the team. The team then determines the sensitivity of each asset so that it can plan how to secure each one accordingly. Controlling access. Identification. These are assertions made by users about who they are. Authentication is the proving of that assertion. Today it's usually by user ID and password, but it also could be by third-party, not third-party, but by two-factor authentication, which would be, for example, getting a text message on your smartphone before you can actually log into a site. A lot of banks and credit cards do that in order to ensure security. Authorization, the permissions a legitimate user or process has on the system. And accountability, tracking or logging what authenticated and unauthenticated users do while accessing the system. Documentation procedures and guidelines. The most common documentation requirements include sensitive assets list. What assets must the organization take measures to secure? The list can include computers, network components, database documents, and any other assets that could be vulnerable to attack. The organization's security process. How does it all work? The authority of the persons responsible for security. Which administrator is responsible or authorized for what assets and what actions? And the policies, procedures, and guidelines adopted by the organization. What information needs to be communicated, how is it communicated, and when is it communicated? An organization must comply with rules on two levels. Regulatory compliance, the organization must comply with laws and government regulations. And organizational compliance, the organization must comply with its own policies, audits, culture, and standards. One point I need to make, regulatory compliance does not always mean government regulation. For example, for you to take credit cards, you may need to have PCI or payment card industry certification so that your company adheres to the most secure standards for taking credit cards. If you're not PCI compliant, it's possible that they're going to take that certification from you if you had it, and it's possible also that customers may not deal with your business because you're not PCI compliant if they're even aware of that. Disaster assessment and recovery. The Security Administration team handles incidents, disasters, and other interruptions. The Emergency Operations Group is responsible for protecting the sensitive data in the event of natural disasters, equipment failure, and other potential emergencies. Security outsourcing. Of course, there are advantages to this, and the first is the main advantage is that the company you're outsourcing to will probably have a high level of expertise in security because it focuses on security and security only every day. Simply put, it will have expertise and experience that your own organization may not have. Your organization may not have people that are technically proficient to install security systems, such as intrusion detection systems on your network. But of course, there are disadvantages. The outsourcing firm might not possess internal knowledge. They may not know much about your organization. And of course, if they haven't already looked into your organization, they probably don't. And then you also won't be able to develop in-house capability or talent, and you might have to continue to pay for these outsourced services indefinitely. Concerns about outsourcing. Privacy. Does the third party agree to uphold your privacy policy? How do they plan to control how data are collected, stored, handled, and destroyed? Risk. What additional risks exist by transferring data over a trust boundary? How are any new risks addressed? Who is responsible for managing new outsourcing risks? Data security. What controls protect data confidentiality and integrity from unauthorized access? Are access controls consistent with the internal controls, known as for the outsourced companies' access controls? How is data availability protected? Are backups and redundancy measures in place to minimize downtime? How are backups and redundant data copies protected? Ownership. Who owns the data, the infrastructure, and the media? Who is responsible for each component? Your company or the third party? And adherence to policy. Does each third party commit to upholding your security policies and procedures? If you are going to use a third party, some common agreements include service level agreements or SLAs. This type of agreement is a formal contract between your organization and the outside firm that details the specific services the firm will provide. Blanket purchase agreement or a BPA, a streamlined method of meeting recurring needs for supplies or services. A BPA creates pre-approved accounts with qualified suppliers to fulfill recurring orders for products or services. BPAs can be very helpful in simplifying the process of recurring purchases. A Memorandum of Understanding or MOU, also called a letter of intent. An MOU is an agreement between two or more parties that expresses areas of common interest that result in shared actions. MOUs are generally less enforceable than a formal agreement, but still more formal than an oral agreement. An Interconnection Security Agreement, or ISA, often an extension of an MOU, the ISA serves as an agreement that documents the technical requirements of interconnected assets. This type of document is most often used to specify technical needs and security responsibilities of connected organizations. So let's talk about compliance and professional ethics. Compliance. Event logs. These are records of actions that your operating system or application software create. A compliance liaison makes sure all personnel are aware of and comply with the organization's policies. Remediation involves fixing something that is broken or defective. Professional ethics. Set the example. Demonstrate strong ethical principles in your daily activities. Users will follow your lead. If you are serious about ethics, your users will be more serious about ethics. Encourage adopting ethical guidelines and standards. Security professionals must know their ethical boundaries and set an example by adhering to them. This often means making difficult decisions and setting a good example. You must push the organization to define its code of ethics. This helps the staff operate ethically and responsibly. Inform users through security awareness training. Make sure users are aware of and understand their ethical responsibilities. And a code of ethics helps ensure professionalism. Common fallacies about ethics. Users assume that computers should prevent abuse. If they can gain unauthorized access, it's the organization's fault, not theirs. Some users believe that in some legal systems, they have the right to explore security vulnerabilities as a form of free speech or expression. Users think their actions may cause only minor damage. They think that a little damage won't bother anyone. Users think that it's easy to break in, that if it's easy to break in, it must be all right to do so. Users think that hacking is okay if their motives aren't damaging. They think that if they aren't making any money or otherwise advancing themselves by hacking, they aren't committing a crime. And lastly, users think information should be free. They think it's okay to look through somebody's system to obtain information. Let's talk about personnel security. Personnel security principles. Limiting access. The idea here is that users should be granted only the levels of permissions they need in order to perform their duties. It's also called the principle of least privilege. Always use this principle. Otherwise, you run the risk of allowing unauthorized users access to information they shouldn't be able to access. An example is weak access controls may allow a sales clerk to view employee salaries. Separation of duties. This breaks a task into subtasks that different users must carry out. This means a single user cannot carry out a critical task without the help or approval of another user. An example is this helps ensure that a user cannot create a new vendor himself and then cut a check to that vendor himself. Job rotation. This minimizes risk by rotating employees among various systems or duties. It prevents collusion where several employees conspire to commit fraud. It also gives managers a chance to track which users were authorized to take what actions and when they took them. Mandatory vacation. Similar to job rotation, this provides a chance to detect fraud. When users are on vacation, you suspend their access to your environment. This prevents them from working at home where they may attempt to cover their tracks. Security training. This is to develop a strong security training and awareness program. It helps gain support of all employees. They become advocates for security. It ensures that employees are careful to avoid security breaches and helps them understand the policies and procedures required to make their organization a secure environment. Security awareness. This should address the requirements and expectations of your security policy. It's different from a formal training program. You use posters, emails, and employee newsletters to teach users about security objectives, inform users about threats and trends in security, and motivate users to comply with security policies. And lastly, social engineering, deceiving or using people to get around security controls. Attacks include intimidation, which includes threats or harassment, name dropping, using the names of managers or superiors to convince another person that a higher authority has allowed access to the information. 3, appeals for help, tugging at a person's sense of compassion, emotional appeal. And 4, lastly, phishing, where users fall for phishing emails. Now let's talk about security policies. The infrastructure for an IT security policy includes policies, standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines, and we'll talk about each one of these. Security policies. Written security policies document the management's goals and objectives. They explain the company's security needs and their commitment to meeting those needs. It should read like a short summary of key facts. If too complex, management has trouble approving it. For example, a goods policy might read simply, security is essential to the future of our organization. It shouldn't be very specific. You're going to have procedures that will then build upon that and show how it's going to be followed. The primary purpose of any security-related policy is to reduce risk. They aren't much of a value if they're not read by the employees, available to the employees, enforced if somebody violates it, or updated as changes come about. Here we see the security policy environment where regulations, organizational objectives, organizational goals, laws, and shareholders' interests all combine to create an overarching organizational policy within the corporation's environment and the management security statement. All of these feed into the policies. Here we see the hierarchy. Organizational security policy, a statement by top-level management that security is important to the organization and the activities pursuant to a secure state will be recognized, supported, and funded. And then functional policies in support of an organizational policies. Some examples: acceptable use, antivirus, interconnection, email use, firewall, host security, wireless use, extranet, and a whole bunch of others. These are all functions that the organization does or uses to promote cybersecurity. A functional policy declares an organization's management direction for securing such specific functional areas as email, remote access, and internet surfing. Departments responsible for these functional policies write them out. Example, human resources, IT operations, and facilities would each produce their own specific functional policies. Although there might be one policy for the whole corporation antivirus, um, there could be organizational groupings within the company that would have their own specific functional policies. Functional policies should use strong language, such as will and must. Most people consider should as merely a suggestion, not a mandate. A good access control policy reads, all authorized users must be allowed to do only their authorized tasks. Unauthorized users must not have access to the company, systems, or resources. And then as it shows in this chart here, the supporting mechanisms for the functional policies include standards, which define specific products and mechanisms used to support policy, procedures define the actions to implement policy standards and baselines. Baselines define the minimum required parameters to achieve a consistent security level, and guidelines, which define recommended or not yet required actions. So let's look at each one of these. Standards, mandated requirements for hardware and software solutions used to address security risks throughout an organization. They might refer to a specific antivirus product, for example, or a password generation token. When a standard is in place, it means the organization has selected a solution and that solution only to fulfill a policy goal. Procedures. These are step-by-step systematic actions to accomplish a security requirement, process, or objective. They are one of the most powerful tools available to you. They can provide documentation of the way you do business and ensure that no employee's critical knowledge is only in his or her head. Procedures cover things such as changing passwords, responding to incidents, and creating backups. The following are all true of procedures. They reduce mistakes in a crisis. They ensure you don't miss important steps. They provide for places within the process. They are mandatory requirements like policies and standards. Baselines. These define the basic configurations for specific types of computers or devices. An example, having a document that lists the components and configuration settings for a standard workstation makes it easy to ensure that all the new workstations are identical. Basic configurations, known as baselines, ensure that they enforce the security minimums. And lastly, baselines are helpful in configuring new computers or devices, as well as for comparing with existing systems to see if they still meet the minimums. Guidelines. These help provide structure to a security program. They outline recommendations for the purchase and use of acceptable products and systems. They are simply actions that the organization recommends. They usually exist in the form of white papers, best practices, or other formats defined by an organization's security program. You have to carefully select the words you use in a guideline because a few wrong words can transform a guideline into a company standard or even a policy. So this is the end of part 1. Part 2 will contain data classification standards, configuration management, the change management process, application software security, and software development and security.